this isn't just a theoretical debate. No matter how much John Mearsheimer and those who follow him would like to reduce this to academic theory, these are real people's lives. And we've got 30 years of history to test whether those theories actually work in real life. The bottom line is they don't. The simple fact is that Russia, over all of these years, has invaded countries that are not members of NATO but are next to Russia, and has not invaded those that are. Let me just give a couple of examples. NATO expansion, NATO enlargement, is blamed for Russia's aggressive instincts. But Russia was invading countries around its periphery in the very early 1990s when NATO was nowhere near. Second example, anybody that's been watching this for more than a couple of weeks will remember how after the seizure of Crimea in 2015, 2016, the big fear was that Russia would go next for the Baltic states, for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. We don't hear those conversations at all anymore. Why is that? Because NATO recognized the problem and made it plain that all of NATO would be involved in defending those countries. So the simple fact is that when countries apply for membership in NATO, they are doing so because of fear of Russia. And Russia, if it did not want them to apply to NATO, could simply stop threatening its neighbors.
Okay, I'm going to try my best to put forward the counter-argument here. I mean, some critics would say that, for example, the NATO-backed intervention in Libya had nothing to do with being a defensive alliance. You know, that they unilaterally effectively took that decision, and we now have Libya, you know, having open slave markets in ways that, you know, they never had before, and they've just had their hands washed NATO.
Well, let's not take an absolutely absolutist line on this, because let's not forget that there are some cases in which Russia has, in fact, been right. And all of the negative consequences of the Western backing for a change of regime in Libya that Russia was predicting have, in fact, come true. It's not just human rights. It's regional instability. It's the migration problem. It is weapons proliferation. All of those things were, in fact, absolutely correct. The problem is people extrapolate from that to think that NATO has aggressive designs on Russia itself. And that is, if you look at it from the Kremlin point of view, which is what Mary is so very good at, precisely why Russia thinks that NATO is in fact aggressively bringing into itself all of these countries around its periphery. In fact, Vladimir Putin himself said that the danger was NATO, as he put it, mounting a dangerous attempt to seize Ukrainian territory. But that is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how NATO works. It doesn't acquire countries. It accepts membership applications. Russia thinks it is like the old Warsaw Pact, also a supposedly defensive alliance, but one which persistently invaded itself.
But Keir, I guess critics would say that, you know, NATO was set up in opposition to, you know, the Soviet Union and afterwards Russia. I mean, almost by definition, because Russia cannot enter NATO, and there has been some talk within Russia over the last 20 years about possibly even, you know, having NATO membership, that actually they are right to think of NATO as an entity that exists for the very purposes of creating some kind of binary opposition to Russia. So even if we don't agree with their system, their ethos, their policies within that society, that is the reality of how they're structured, and that actually NATO exists in order to place itself in opposition to Russia.
That's exactly correct. NATO exists and has always existed to protect countries from Moscow. And what we're seeing playing out in Ukraine now shows exactly why that's essential.
But then the argument would then be that Russia is then understandable or justified in thinking that that the expansion of NATO eastward would threaten them.
Well, that only holds true if Russia itself wants to expand westwards. If Russia itself has designs on these countries in between, then NATO is a problem. If Russia doesn't have any aggressive intent, then NATO isn't a problem. All of the talk about the security guarantees for Russia, quote unquote, that we heard before the invasion, actually went based on a failure to read what Russia was actually demanding. Russia didn't want security guarantees for itself. It wanted to take them away. It wanted, in fact, NATO and the United States to take them away from all of the countries of Eastern Europe, which were under Moscow's domain before. And in fact, when Mary, our missing other guest, said at the end of January that Putin said, she said, had not, repeat, not Putin's mission to reconstitute the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. It was deeply unfair of President Putin just a few years later to explain in his address to Russia that that was precisely what he wanted to do. NATO is the obstacle that actually protects all of those free peoples of Europe from what Russia wants to do to them.